The galaxy had known peace for centuries. Alien races, each with their own civilizations, had carved out their places in the vastness of space. They were strong, proud, and had grown used to their dominance. Life flowed in a steady rhythm, but deep within the heart of one small planet, something stirred. Humanity was about to make its mark on the galaxy. Earth, a planet filled with ambition and curiosity, had long dreamed of reaching the stars. Their scientists, engineers, and explorers had worked together for decades to create something that could travel across space, and now, that dream had been realized. The Resolute, Earth's first interstellar warship, stood ready to face the unknown. Inside the Resolute, the crew was nervous. They had trained for years, but this was different. They weren't just exploring. They were entering a conflict that no one on Earth had ever seen. The officers and soldiers gathered in the war room, eyes fixed on the holographic display in front of them. The map showed their course, a direct path into alien territory, where no human had ever set foot. The mission was clear. They would show the galaxy that humanity was no longer a quiet observer. The commander, Captain Marcus Hayes, stood at the head of the room, his face stern but calm. He had seen the reports, he knew the risks, yet he also knew what humanity was capable of. "We're not just going to explore," he said to his crew, his voice steady. "We're going to prove that we are a force to be reckoned with." His words echoed. In the room, the crew nodded, understanding the weight of their mission. Outside the Resolute, the galaxy was silent. There were no signs of impending war, no cries of alarm from distant civilizations. For now, everything was calm. The stars glimmered. The vast emptiness of space spread out endlessly. It was the perfect moment for the Resolute to make its first journey. But deep down, Captain Hayes knew that peace, no matter how long it lasted, was only temporary. The calm would soon break. The Resolute powered up its engines, and the ship slowly began to drift away from Earth. Its massive, sleek frame gleamed in the light of distant stars. Humanity was stepping into the unknown, ready to challenge the power of civilizations that had ruled the galaxy for centuries. Yet, no one knew exactly what awaited them. That as the ship moved further into space, the crew braced themselves. The vastness of the galaxy was inspiring, but it was also intimidating. There were countless alien species, and each had their own way of life. Some were peaceful, others were hostile, and a few were somewhere in between. The Resolute was heading straight into a region of space known to be dominated by a powerful alien empire, the Valdar. These aliens were known for their advanced technology and ruthless tactics. They had conquered many worlds, and they believed that they were the rightful rulers of the galaxy. The Resolute's mission was simple: show the Valdar that humanity could not be ignored. They had no idea that their presence would send ripples through the galaxy. Earth had no idea that the Valdar had been watching them for years. They were aware of humanity's rapid advancements and had taken note of the Resolute's launch, but they hadn't thought much of it. In their eyes, humanity was just another species, more untested and insignificant. As the ship continued its journey, the crew gathered in the observation deck. The stars stretched out before them, countless points of light in the blackness. The officers spoke in low voices, wondering what they would find. Would they encounter a hostile force? Would the Valdar even take them seriously? Suddenly, a soft beep interrupted the silence. It was a message from the ship's sensors officer. "Captain, we've detected something. A signal." The crew fell silent as Captain Hayes stepped forward. "What kind of signal?" he asked, his voice sharp with curiosity. "It's faint, but it's there," the officer replied. "It could be a distress signal or a warning." Captain Hayes studied the screen in front of him. "Send a reply," he ordered. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The officer nodded and quickly typed a response. As they waited for an answer, the crew felt a sense of unease. The galaxy had always seemed so distant and empty, yet now it felt closer. The unknown was right in front of them, and they were about to find out if humanity was truly ready for what lay ahead. The seconds stretched into minutes as the ship drifted farther into alien space. There was no immediate response to the signal. The Resolute continued on its path, and with each passing moment, the tension grew. The calm before the storm was slowly slipping away, and the crew knew it. They could feel it in the air. The galaxy would not stay silent for long. A storm was coming, and humanity would soon be at the heart of it. The Resolute glided through the cold emptiness of space, its massive engines humming softly as it moved deeper into alien territory. The crew, once confident in their mission, now felt a quiet unease. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath. There was no sign of the Valdar fleet yet, but the crew knew they were close. The vast expanse of stars seemed endless, a reminder of just how small they were in the grand scheme of things. But humanity's resolve was strong, and the crew had trained for this moment. They were ready to make their mark on the galaxy. Inside the ship, everything was tense. The crew moved about their stations, eyes flicking to their screens as they awaited any signs of trouble. Commander Hayes stood by the observation window, staring into the vastness of space. His hands were clasped behind his back, but his mind raced. The mission was going as planned, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had been in space long enough to know that things rarely went as expected. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sharp beep. The sensors officer turned to Hayes, his face pale. "Captain, we're picking up a large fleet. It's definitely not human," he said, his voice trembling. Hayes turned quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. He stepped forward, peering at the display on the officer's screen. There it was, an entire fleet of ships, massive and powerful. Closing in on the Resolute. "Identify them," Hayes ordered. The officer's fingers danced across his controls, his eyes flicking nervously between the screens. "I can't say for sure, sir, but these ships don't match any known species designs. They single quotes read ... different." The tension in the room thickened. The crew had expected trouble, but not this. This was the moment they had feared. Hayes knew that if they were facing the Valdar, their first contact would be anything but peaceful. He turned back to the rest of the room, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. "All hands, prepare for possible contact. Raise shields and get ready to respond." The ship's engines hummed louder, the Resolute shifting as its defensive systems powered up. Hayes felt the weight of the moment. Humanity had come to prove itself, but they hadn't planned for an encounter this soon. The fleet of unknown ships was fast approaching, and the Resolute was still in their sights. There was no turning back. Now. The communication officer tapped his console urgently, his voice breaking the silence. "Captain, we've received a transmission. It's from the lead ship in the fleet." Hayes took a deep breath, put it through. A holographic image flickered to life in front of them. The image was of a tall, armored figure, its skin dark and leathery, its face covered by a helmet. The figure's voice was deep and intimidating, carrying a tone of authority. "Human vessel, you are entering Valdar space. This is your final warning. Turn back now, or face the consequences." The crew was silent. Hayes felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This was the first test of humanity's resolve. The Valdar had made it clear they were not to be trifled with, but Hayes knew they had no choice. They had come this far. He stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with determination. "This is Captain Marcus Hayes of the Resolute. We are not here to turn back. We are here to make a stand. Humanity will not be cowed. We demand your respect." The Valdar commander let out a low, harsh laugh. "You demand respect. You are nothing but ants beneath our feet. Prepare to be crushed." Before Hayes could respond, the hologram flickered, and the transmission cut off. The fleet of Valdar ships surged forward, closing the gap between them and the Resolute with terrifying speed. The battle was about to begin. The crew sprang into action. Weapon systems were primed, and the Resolute's shields flared to life, glowing with energy. The alien fleet had the numbers, but humanity had something they didn't: unpredictability. Hayes knew they couldn't match the Valdar in sheer firepower, but they had the element of surprise. The Resolute had been designed for agility, able to outmaneuver even the most powerful warships. It was humanity's only advantage. The ship jolted as the first blast hit. The shields flared, absorbing the impact, but the crew could feel the power behind the attack. "Return fire," Hayes commanded, his voice sharp with authority. The weapons officer fired the first volley of laser blasts, striking one of the Valdar ships. It shuddered, and a massive explosion lit up the darkness of space. The crew cheered, but Hayes remained focused. This was just the beginning. The fleet didn't hesitate. They returned fire with deadly accuracy, their weapons hitting the Resolute again and again. The ship rocked violently, alarms blaring as the crew scrambled to maintain control. Hayes gripped the armrest of his command chair, his mind racing. This wasn't going to be an easy fight, but humanity was never one to back down from a challenge. They would hold their ground. "Evasive maneuvers," Hayes ordered. "Take them by surprise." The Resolute lurched as it changed direction, dodging the next series of blasts. The Valdar ships, accustomed to their overwhelming strength, struggled to keep up. The humans were faster, more agile, and with each successful dodge, the tension among the crew grew. This was their moment. They weren't going to lose. The battle raged on, each side exchanging blows, but the Resolute held its ground. The alien fleet was powerful, but humanity had something they hadn't counted on: willpower. The Valda had underestimated humanity, and in that moment, the galaxy itself began to shudder. The Resolute continued its high-speed maneuvers, weaving through the oncoming fire from the Valdar fleet. The crew's nerves were taut, but their focus was sharp. The hum of the ship's engines mixed with the constant blare of alarms, signaling that the battle had escalated into something more than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just about a fight for survival anymore. It was about humanity's very presence in the galaxy, and they were determined to prove they weren't just another footnote in the stars. Captain Hayes stood at the command center, his hands gripping the edge of the console. His mind raced as the Resolute dodged another volley of laser fire. But the Valda had already proven they were a powerful enemy, but they didn't know the strength of humanity's will. "Keep moving, keep firing," Hayes muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. The first wave of Valdar ships had been pushed back, but there were still hundreds more on the way. Their fleet was massive, an ocean of steel, and firepower that seemed endless. Hayes knew they couldn't keep this up forever. The Resolute had firepower, but it was only one ship. They would need reinforcements, and fast. Suddenly, the ship shuddered again, this time from a massive shockwave that sent the crew sprawling. The whole vessel groaned under the pressure as the shields flickered and dimmed. A look of concern passed between the officers on the bridge. The Resolute had taken significant damage, but they couldn't stop now. There was no turning back. "Status report," Hayes barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Shields at 40%, Captain," the sensors officer replied, his hands flying over his controls. "We've taken heavy hits to the outer hull. Some systems are failing. We can't let them hit us again," Hayes said, his voice low but his mind calculating. They needed to even the odds. "Weapons, take out their lead ship. Focus all firepower on it. We need to cripple their command." The weapons officer didn't hesitate. He locked onto the lead Valdar ship, the one that seemed to be giving orders to the rest of the fleet. The Resolute fired its full arsenal: lasers, missiles, everything they had. The Valdar ship absorbed the first wave, but it wasn't enough to stop the relentless barrage of humanity's firepower. The ship trembled as another blast hit, but it kept firing. For a few moments it looked as if the Valdar ship would hold, but then a massive explosion erupted. The lead ship, once brimming with power and confidence, shattered into 1,000 pieces, sending debris spiraling through space. A cheer erupted on the bridge, but it was short-lived. The victory was small, and the battle was far from over. "Target their weapons," Hayes ordered. "We can't afford to lose our shields again." The Resolute began to pivot, angling itself to target the weapon systems on the remaining Valdar ships. Each shot was a calculated strike, aimed at weakening their enemy's defenses. But the Valdar were relentless. They had seen the Resolute's power and now understood humanity's resolve. The remaining ships reorganized, forming a defensive perimeter. It was clear they weren't going to let the Resolute get another shot in without a fierce response. Another wave of fire came, but this time it was different. The lasers from the Valdar ships hit with a crushing force, stronger than anything they had faced so far. The Resolute rocked, its hull groaning as the powerful blasts tore through its outer defenses. The alarms screamed louder, warning the crew of the imminent danger. The ship's shields flickered, then flickered again, struggling to hold against the onslaught. Captain Hayes gritted his teeth, a mix of frustration and determination crossing his face. He knew they couldn't keep this up. They were outnumbered and outgunned. They needed something more, something unexpected. It was the only way to make it through this. "Engine room, can we get more power to the shields?" Hayes called over the "Comes working on it, Captain," came the quick reply. "We've rerouted everything we've got, but we're running low on power. We can't hold for long." "Then we make our move now," Hayes said, his voice steady. "All hands, brace for a full-throttle evasive maneuver. Get us close enough to their command fleet. We're going to make them feel our presence." The crew exchanged confused glances. It was risky, but Hayes had always been known for taking risks. He wasn't about to back down now. The Resolute pushed forward, its engines screaming as it accelerated toward the heart of the Valdar fleet. The alien ships, momentarily caught off guard, struggled to react. The Resolute cut through their lines, like a blade through water, maneuvering at unbelievable speeds. The crew held their breath as they passed close to the enemy ships, so close they could almost feel the heat of the blasts. "Now," Hayes shouted. The weapons officer fired everything. The Resolute unleashed a barrage of missiles and laser blasts, hitting critical systems on the closest Valdar ships. One by one they exploded in fiery bursts, sending shock waves through the enemy's ranks. But the Valdar were resilient. They quickly adjusted, sending another wave of destruction toward the Resolute. The ship shuddered as the blast hit, and, for a moment, everything went dark. The crew held their breath. This was it. Would they survive? Would humanity's first fight end in defeat? But just as the lights flickered back on, a new message came through the comms, one that neither Hayes nor the crew were prepared for. Human ship, you are strong, but not strong enough. The voice on the other end was different. Khmer, calculating, prepare for the consequences. The crew stared at the screen, waiting for what would come next. The galaxy had truly begun to shudder. The storm was here, and humanity was right in the middle of it. The Resolute was barely holding on. The ship's once pristine hull was now scarred from the relentless barrage of alien fire, and the crew was working tirelessly to keep the ship intact. The glow of the control panels seemed dimmer now, the flickering lights casting shadows on the faces of the crew members, who were exhausted but determined. They had expected a fierce fight, but nothing had prepared them for the sheer power of the Valdar. Captain Hayes stood at the helm, his face hard with resolve. Sweat dripped down his forehead, but he didn't wipe it away. His mind was elsewhere, calculating, processing every detail. The Valdar had underestimated humanity, but the battle was far from won. There was a gnawing feeling in his gut, one that told him something bigger was coming, something more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. The battle outside raged on, but inside the Resolute the tension was unbearable. The crew had done everything they could to outmaneuver the Valdar, but they were still outnumbered. The weapons were running low, and the shields were barely functional. They needed a miracle, and they needed it fast. Then it happened. The communications officer, her hands trembling as she worked, called out, "Captain, we've intercepted a transmission from within the Valdar fleet. It's coming from one of our own." Hayes whipped around. "What do you mean, from one of our own?" "It's an encrypted message, Captain, but the code, it's human." The room fell silent. For a moment, Hayes couldn't breathe. A traitor, in their midst. His heart raced. He knew this was possible. There had always been the risk of betrayal, in war, but to have it happen now, when their survival hung by a thread, it was almost too much to process. "Play it," Hayes ordered, his voice cold. The officer tapped a few buttons, and the room filled with the crackling sound of static. Then a voice, familiar but twisted, cut through the noise. "Captain, you don't know what you've stumbled into," the voice said, its tone full of arrogance. "You think you're ready to face the Valdar. You're just a pawn in a much larger game." It was Commander David Hale, the second in command on the Resolute. Hayes had trusted him, had worked alongside him for years, and now, hearing his voice on the enemy's transmission, a sickening feeling settled in Hayes' chest. "We've been feeding you information from the inside," Captain Hale continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think we're fighting to protect humanity? You're fighting for a losing cause. The Valdar have already won. You're too late." A cold silence followed as Hayes processed the betrayal. The crew members glanced nervously at each other, uncertain of what to do next. Hayes' mind raced. Hale had been the one person he'd counted on to keep things in order. This was a devastating blow, one that had the potential to destroy everything they'd worked for. "We've been helping them," Hayes muttered under his breath, as though trying to convince himself it wasn't true, but there was no denying it. The message had been clear. Hale had turned against them. He had sided with the Valdar captain. The communications officer said, breaking the silence, "There's more." The message mentions something about a contingency plan. He said, "We're going to be taken care of before the battle ends." A cold sweat washed over Hayes. A contingency plan. What had Hale planned for them? He had to act fast. If Hale had betrayed them, they couldn't trust anyone. The crew was in danger, and the Valdar were still closing in. "We need to get to the lower levels," Hayes barked, his voice filled with authority. "Get security teams in position. We need to find Hale, and we need to do it now. No one goes anywhere alone." He turned and looked out the viewport. The Resolute was surrounded by the Valdar fleet, and though they had managed to land a few blows, the fight was far from over. If Hale's plan was part of a larger scheme to weaken their defenses from within, they would never survive. As the crew scrambled to carry out orders, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. The Valdar had already shown their ruthlessness, and now their own people were turning against them. The ship seemed smaller now, the corridors more oppressive. The Resolute had been humanity's symbol of strength and pride, but in that moment, it felt like nothing more than a fragile shell, drifting through a hostile universe. The security team moved quickly through the ship, their boots thudding on the metal floor as they approached Hale's quarters. The air was thick with tension as they reached the door. Hayes couldn't help but wonder what he would find inside. Was Hale working with the Valdar as a spy, or had he been manipulated somehow? And what was his contingency plan? The door to Hale's quarters slid open with a hiss. The room was dimly lit, and there was a strange stillness in the air. It felt wrong. Hayes stepped inside, followed closely by the security officers. The room was empty. Suddenly, a soft click echoed through the room and Hayes spun around. The lights flashed on, revealing a hidden door at the far side of the room. The door was slightly ajar. Someone had left it open. "We're not alone," Hayes muttered, his voice tense. "Stay alert." The team moved quickly, their weapons raised. Hayes pushed the door open, revealing a narrow hallway that led to a small control room. The flickering screens inside showed the Resolute from various angles. It was clear that Hale had been in communication with the Valdar long before now, but what he didn't expect to find was the harsh reality of their situation. A terminal in the room showed a countdown timer, and Hayes could feel his pulse quicken. The Valdar were preparing to strike again, and this time, they would have the upper hand. The traitor had ensured their destruction from within. The air inside the Resolute was thick with uncertainty. Hayes stood in the control room, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He had trusted Hale, trusted him like a brother. Now, that trust lay shattered in the cold, harsh reality of betrayal. The ship's sensors were still active, and the countdown on the terminal continued ticking down relentlessly. The Valdar were preparing to make their final move, and with Hale's betrayal, humanity's fate seemed darker than ever. "Captain, what now?" the communications officer asked, her voice soft but steady. She had been with Hayes from the beginning, and he could see the same uncertainty in her eyes. They were all in this together, but the betrayal ran deep. "I don't know," Hayes muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'll be damned if we go down without a fight." The crew gathered around him, the weight of the situation settling over them like a blanket. They had already fought through the unexpected, surviving the first wave of Valdar attacks, but now, with the traitor in their midst and their ship battered, it felt like they were on the edge of something far worse. "We've got to stop that countdown," Hayes said, his voice gaining strength. "If the Valdar are launching another wave, we have to disrupt it. Whatever Hale was planning, we can't let it happen." The security team, still on high alert, began sweeping the area. Hayes could feel the heat of their determination. No one spoke, but the energy in the room was palpable. It was as if the crew understood the gravity of the moment. This was more than just a battle against a Valdar. It was a fight for their survival, a fight to show that humanity could withstand the odds, no matter how overwhelming they seemed. As the crew worked in silence, Hayes couldn't help but think about what had led them to this point. They had come to the galaxy with hope, an ambition, seeking to make their mark among the stars. But now, that same ambition seemed like a curse. The galaxy was no place for hope, it was a place for power. The Valdar had made that clear, and Hale had been their key to survival. Or so he thought. The ship groaned beneath them as another series of blasts struck the hull, rattling the Resolute. The alarms blared, and Hayes' heart skipped a beat. The Valdar were closing in once again. They weren't waiting. This was their moment to finish what they had started. "How much time do we have left?" Hayes asked, his eyes fixed on the terminal. 5 minutes, the officer replied, her voice tight with anxiety. It was too soon for them to be in this much danger. The crew had fought hard, but they had no way of knowing just how much damage the Valdar had already inflicted. The countdown was relentless, ticking down with a cold, mechanical certainty. They were running out of time. "We need to get to the engine room," Hayes said, determination flaring in his chest. "We're going to overload the engines. If we can't stop the Valdar, at least we'll take as many of them down with us as we can." The crew members exchanged uneasy glances, but there was no hesitation. They knew what had to be done. They would make their stand, no matter the cost. The team moved swiftly through the corridors of the Resolute, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the walls. The ship was a maze of metallic corridors, each turn leading them deeper into the heart of the Resolute. Hayes led the way, his mind focused on the mission ahead. There would be no second chances. They either succeeded or they would die trying. As they entered the engine room, the smell of burning circuits filled the air. The ship was struggling to stay alive, but the crew kept pushing forward. The engines were still functioning, but they were damaged, barely holding together. Hayes moved to the control panel, his fingers dancing over the keys as he initiated the override. "We don't have much time," Hayes said, his voice tight. "Get ready." The engines began to hum louder, the ship trembling beneath their feet. A low, ominous growl filled the room as the systems powered up, preparing for the overload. Hayes knew that this was a one-way trip. There would be no coming back from this. They were going to make sure the Valdar knew that humanity was not to be underestimated. As the countdown reached its final seconds, Hayes watched the terminal, his eyes narrowing in concentration. They had done everything they could to fight back, to disrupt the Valdar's plans, but now it was up to the crew to make sure their legacy lived on. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for humanity's place in the galaxy. Final blast shook the Resolute, sending sparks flying through the engine room. The crew braced themselves, their hearts racing. The countdown was almost over. Now, Hayes shouted, slamming his fist onto the control panel. The engine room erupted in a brilliant flash of light. The ship's systems overloaded, sending a shockwave through the Valdar fleet. The shockwave ripped through space, distorting the fabric of the universe itself. The Resolute shuddered one last time, its systems failing as the shockwave tore through its core. For a moment there was silence. The crew held their breath, waiting for the inevitable. But as the seconds stretched into eternity, they realized something. The Valdar fleet was no longer advancing. In fact, it was retreating. The shockwave had hit them hard. The Resolute's final act of defiance had disrupted their plans, leaving them vulnerable. Hayes could hardly believe it. They had done it. The Valdar were retreating. For the first time in what felt like forever, the crew of the Resolute dared to hope. They had survived. Against all odds, humanity had stood its ground. But as Hayes stood in the ruined engine room, staring out into the silent void of space, he knew that this was only the beginning. The galaxy had noticed humanity's power, and it would not soon forget the fight they had started. The silence that followed the explosion was deafening. For a moment, everything seemed frozen, suspended in time. The Resolute drifted through the darkness, its hull battered and broken, but it still remained intact, just barely. Inside, the crew could feel the heavy weight of what they had done. The shockwave from their final act had forced the Valdar fleet into a temporary retreat, but at what cost? They had sent a message, but it came at a price one they weren't sure could pay. Captain Hayes stood on the bridge, staring out at the damaged systems. The crew was quiet, their faces marked by exhaustion and uncertainty. The hum of the ship's dying engines filled the air, the only sound in a ship that once thrived with activity. Now, it felt hollow, like the final moments of a dying beast. "We've bought ourselves some time," Hayes said, his voice hoarse but steady. "But we're not out of the woods yet. We don't know what's coming next." He knew the Valdar were ruthless. If they were pulling back, it was only to regroup, to come back stronger. Humanity had made a statement, but the fight wasn't over. Hayes could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The Resolute was all they had left. It had been designed to lead them to victory, but now, it was little more than a shell of what it once was. And with Hale's betrayal still hanging over their heads, they were far from being in the clear. A sudden beeping interrupted the silence. The communications officer's eyes widened as she looked at her screen. "Captain, we've received a transmission," she said, her voice filled with a mix of hope and dread. "It's a distress signal. From a human ship." Hayes stiffened. "A human ship? Well, coordinates are coming through now, Captain," the officer replied, her fingers flying over the console. It's from the Outer Rim, near the stronghold." The crew exchanged confused looks. The Outer Rim was a dangerous place, far from the safety of Earth's reach. They hadn't expected to hear from any other human ships out here, especially not with the Valdar so close. Hayes turned to the officer, his expression darkening. "Put it on screen," he ordered. The screen flickered to life, revealing a familiar image. It was another human warship, but it wasn't one they recognized. It was smaller than the Resolute, its design older, more rugged. The message that followed was garbled at first, but then the transmission cleared. A woman's voice came through, frantic and desperate. "This is the Fortitude. We are under attack. The Valdar have breached our defenses. We need immediate assistance, please. Help us. We cannot hold on much longer." Hayes' heart skipped a beat. The Fortitude, a ship he knew well, stationed on the fringes of human space. They were supposed to be far from the conflict, but now they were in the thick of it. The crew on the Fortitude were brave, skilled, but they were outmatched. The Valdar had shown no mercy before, and they wouldn't now. "Captain, we can't leave them out there," one of the officers said, his voice filled with urgency. "We have to help them." Hayes nodded grimly. He didn't need to be told. The Fortitude had been one of the first ships to aid them on their journey, and now they were asking for help. But the Resolute was in no condition for a fight. The shields were down, the weapons barely functional. They were limping through space, hoping to find a way to survive. "We're going to help them," Hayes said firmly. "But we need to make sure we can get there without being wiped out first." The crew worked together quickly, rerouting power to the ship's engines and activating the emergency systems. The Resolute shuddered as it powered up, the last remnants of its strength being pushed to the limit. The time was running out, and every second counted. "Get us to the Fortitude," Hayes commanded. "Full speed ahead. Let's see if we can't make a difference." The Resolute lurched forward, its engines straining against the damage. As it made its way toward the distress signal, the crew held their breath. They knew the odds were slim, but they couldn't leave anyone behind. If they were going to survive this war, they had to stick together. As they approached the coordinates, the Fortitude appeared on their sensors. The ship was barely holding together, its hull torn by laser fire and the unmistakable signs of an alien assault. The Valdar were still there, and they weren't planning to leave anytime soon. "Prepare for immediate engagement," Hayes barked. "We can't just sit and watch them die." The crew responded without hesitation, their hands moving with practiced precision. They had no choice but to go all in. The Resolute's remaining weapons were weak, but the element of surprise could still work in their favor. Hayes could see the Fortitude through the viewport, now its lights dimmed, smoke rising from its wrecked sections. "Fire everything we've got," Hayes shouted. "Don't stop until they're gone." The Resolute opened fire, its remaining weapons streaking across space, lighting up the blackness. The Valdar ships, caught off guard by the sudden attack, tried to retaliate, but the Resolute was quick, darting in and out of enemy fire. Hayes watched in grim satisfaction as one of the Valdar ships exploded, a flash of light sending debris scattering across the void. Another went dark, its power systems failing after a well-placed hit from the Resolute. But as the battle raged, Hayes knew it was a temporary victory. The Fortitude wasn't out of danger yet, and the Valdar were regrouping. They would need more than just quick strikes to survive this. Suddenly, the Fortitude sent out a new transmission. "Thank you, but the Valdar, they're sending reinforcements. We can't hold them off much longer." Hayes clenched his fists. It wasn't over. The fight was far from finished, and the Valdar had already shown they wouldn't stop until humanity was crushed. But now, they had a chance to turn the tide. They weren't alone anymore. "Hold on, Fortitude," Hayes muttered, as the crew braced themselves for what was coming next. "Help is on the way." The chaos of the battlefield raged around them as the Resolute moved with all the speed it had left, dodging fire from the Valdar reinforcements. The ship, battered and bruised, was fighting against time itself. The Fortitude was hanging by a thread, its crew desperate, but the Resolute was their last hope. Hayes stood firm at the helm, his eyes fixed on the space ahead, the dim glow of the emergency lights casting long shadows over his face. "Push through, we're almost there," he barked, gripping the edge of his chair as the ship shook violently. The crew, despite their exhaustion, responded with determination. There was no turning back now. Every action they took, every move they made, was for survival. The Valdar ships had regrouped, their reinforcements overwhelming in number. They were closing in on both the Resolute and the Fortitude, their weapons firing relentlessly, tearing into the two ships with unrelenting fury. The crew of the Fortitude was barely holding on. But they had one advantage: they were close enough to the Resolute for the human fleet to mount a full-scale counterattack. The weapons officer on the Resolute fired back with everything they had. Their remaining weapons sputtered, but the crew gave their all, launching every last missile and energy pulse. The Valdar shields cracked, but their ships were far too numerous. For every enemy ship they took down, two more appeared in its place. The odds had never seemed worse, but humanity was different. In the face of overwhelming odds, they had always risen. It wasn't about numbers, it was about the will to fight, and fight they did. "Target their engines. Take out their power," Hayes ordered, his voice low but full of conviction. The Resolute surged forward, its engines screaming in protest as it closed the distance between itself and the Valdar flagship. Hayes watched through the viewport as the massive alien vessel loomed ahead, its armored hull glinting in the faint starlight. The Resolute fired relentlessly, striking the Valdar flagship's engines with precision. The blast sent shockwaves through space, and the alien ship staggered, its power systems flickering. But it wasn't enough to stop them. The Valdar flagship responded with a deadly barrage, its weapons firing at point-blank range. The Resolute shuddered violently, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the crew thought they might not survive. The ship's hull groaned, and alarms screamed as damage reports flooded in. "Shields are down," we've lost auxiliary power. The engineering officer yelled. Hayes felt the weight of their situation. The Resolute was on its last legs, its once systems crumbling under the weight of the Valdar's assault. Yet the crew refused to give up. They had come too far. This was humanity's defining moment. Either they would fall here, or they would rise above the stars and show the galaxy what they were truly capable of. We need to pull back, the helmsman shouted. We can't keep this up. No, Hayes replied, his voice a mixture of fury and resolve. We push forward. We'll make them regret underestimating us. The crew scrambled to reroute the remaining power, focusing it on the ship's remaining weapons. The Resolute surged forward once more, its final strike aimed directly at the heart of the Valdar flagship. Hayes had no illusion that it would be enough to destroy the enemy, but he knew one thing: humanity would never be silenced. Not today, not ever. The final blow came from an unexpected direction. As the Resolute closed in on the Valdar flagship, the Fortitude, still barely holding together, launched one last desperate attack. Its weapons fired in perfect sync with the Resolute's strike, combining their firepower to deliver a devastating, simultaneous blow. The two human ships created a blinding explosion, a burst of light that pierced through the blackness of space like a beacon. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The Resolute and the Fortitude hung in the air, their combined might shaken the galaxy to its core. The Valdar flagship, overwhelmed by the sheer force of the attack, exploded in a fiery display. Pieces of the ship scattered across space, the shockwave pushing the remaining Valdar ships into retreat. The crew of the Resolute stared in disbelief. The Valdar fleet, once an unstoppable force, had been driven back. They had won. Against all odds, humanity had triumphed. Hayes allowed himself a moment of relief, his chest rising and falling as he exhaled a long breath. He had never imagined such a victory. The crew of the Resolute had given everything they had, and in the end, it was enough. But just as the adrenaline began to subside, the voice of the communications officer brought him back to the present. Captain, we're receiving a transmission. It's from ... Earth. Hayes straightened, his heart racing once more. Earth, after everything they'd been through, after the endless fight against the Valdar, hearing a message from home felt like a dream. Put it through, he said, his voice trembling with anticipation. The screen flickered, and then a familiar face appeared. It was Admiral Mitchell, the leader of Earth's fleet, his face serious but with a glimmer of pride in his eyes. Captain Hayes, Mitchell's voice came through the screen. You've done it. The galaxy will know humanity's name after this. Earth's fleet is on its way to reinforce your position. The Valdar have been pushed back, but we need to regroup. Hold your position. Hayes couldn't help but smile. They had done it. They had shown the galaxy that humanity was no longer the underdog. They had proven that no force, no matter how powerful, could stand in their way when they fought for what mattered. Humanity was not just a species fighting for survival, it was a force to be reckoned with. As the Resolute drifted in the wake of their victory, Hayes felt a new sense of purpose wash over him. They had faced the impossible and come out on top. The battle for the galaxy wasn't over, but humanity had earned its place among the stars. The crew of the Resolute stood tall, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they had made history. The galaxy had trembled, and now, it would never forget the name of humanity.